The cold hit first. Not the kind that nips at your fingers, but the kind that settles deep in your chest, making your lungs ache with every breath. On a gray, frozen morning outside Toledo, Ohio, the highway was empty, silent except for the distant hum of passing trucks. A sanitation worker trudged along the shoulder, bundled in a coat too thin for the winter, when something unnatural caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a discarded mannequin, the kind that stores leave behind. But as he stepped closer, the frozen ground beneath his boots seemed to shiver with dread. It was a woman, her body positioned like a careless afterthought. No face to recognize. No fingerprints. No personal items. Nothing. Every identifying feature meticulously removed. And yet, in the icy stillness, there was one detail that refused to vanish. One detail that would unravel everything. Detectives from Lucas County arrived within the hour. Cars with flashing lights lined the highway shoulder, their beams cutting through the morning fog. They stepped onto the frozen earth and saw the impossible. A crime that looked orchestrated, deliberate, almost surgical. Who would go to such lengths to erase a person from existence? And why? These questions hung in the air, heavier than the smoke rising from the coffee cups in the patrol cars. Every glance, every whispered theory was met with the undeniable reality. Someone had planned this. Someone wanted to make sure the world forgot her. But the one thing left behind, that would not be ignored. That would not stay hidden. The body was carefully photographed, measured, catalogued. Each detail that could have helped investigators identify her had been removed. And yet, it was that single anomaly, that single remnant, that made seasoned detectives pause. Across Ohio and into Michigan, forensic experts debated possibilities. They ran prints, traced missing persons reports, compared DNA, combed through Cleveland, Detroit, and Erie, searching for any clue. Still, they hit dead ends. The woman seemed like she had never existed. But investigators weren't convinced. In cases like this, they knew, the smallest oversight could be the thread that unravels a tightly woven lie. As the day stretched on, the story of this unknown woman began to surface in whispers among local news crews and online forums. People began speculating. Was she a runaway? Someone connected to organized crime? Or merely a victim of a random, cruel impulse? But those theories didn't fit the meticulous nature of the crime. This was intentional. Calculated. The kind of horror that unsettles communities across the Midwest. Toledo, Cleveland, Detroit. Somewhere between these cities, this woman had lived, had hoped, had trusted people who might have betrayed her. And in her death, someone wanted to erase not just her presence, but her existence. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine moving from city to city, Cleveland to Detroit, then Erie. Chasing safety, chasing stability, never quite finding either. That was the life of Rebecca Koster. She had struggled with jobs that didn't pay enough, relationships that frayed under stress, and a family network stretched thin across Ohio and Pennsylvania. Vulnerable, she had tried to make connections, to trust, to live a normal life. But normal had a price, and sometimes, trusting the wrong person could cost more than money or comfort. Sometimes it cost everything. Investigators pieced together her last known movements. A friend in Cleveland reported seeing her leaving a diner late one night, bundled against the cold, laughing at a joke she probably didn't remember in the morning. In Detroit, someone noticed her in a grocery store parking lot, bags in hand, looking over her shoulder as if she were being followed. And in Erie, Pennsylvania, a neighbor remembered hearing her car start at odd hours, doors slamming, footsteps that didn't match her own. Each recollection was small, ordinary, yet threaded with unease. Together, they formed a pattern that led directly to the moment she disappeared. Detectives reviewed traffic cameras, street surveillance, everything they could access across state lines. Ohio to Michigan, Michigan to Pennsylvania. Each frame was a potential clue. Each shadow could be the perpetrator. And somewhere along the way, someone close to her had betrayed her. Someone she had trusted when she felt safest. That betrayal would haunt the investigation for months. And while the public debated her identity and her life, the one detail left on her body waited quietly, like a message from the victim herself. It was small, subtle, easy to overlook. But it would not stay hidden. Not to the right eyes. By evening, Toledo's sky had darkened, and the highway where she was found seemed even lonelier than in the morning. The wind carried a whisper through the barren trees, and for the detectives, it felt like the city itself was watching, judging, mourning. That single detail, the one thing left behind, was beginning to make sense, connecting dots across cities, lives, and broken promises. It was enough to make investigators realize the horrifying truth. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal, and the person responsible had underestimated something they shouldn't have. As night fell, a lead emerged, a name whispered in Cleveland, one that nobody expected. It could change everything. But just as they prepared to pursue it, a call came in from Michigan. Another report, another potential lead. A body, discarded, bearing striking similarities, though not confirmed. The investigators froze, realizing the nightmare might stretch beyond Ohio and Pennsylvania, that the trail might be longer and darker than anyone imagined. And in that moment, the story of Rebecca Koster, the young woman whose identity had been so cruelly stripped away, was only beginning. Every question raised another, every lead led to new dangers, and every truth uncovered revealed more betrayal than anyone could have imagined. What was left behind would shock even the most experienced detectives. Pause for a moment. If someone tried to erase you completely, would anyone know it was you? Comment below your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe if you want to uncover the full story of Rebecca Koster as we reveal each shocking layer. As the detectives traced the smallest clue across the snowy streets of Detroit, they didn't realize the person they were chasing was already aware of their investigation. Rebecca Koster had always been a traveler of sorts, not by choice but by necessity. She grew up in a modest home on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio, where life was predictable in its unpredictability. Her parents worked long hours, barely scraping by, and her siblings had scattered across the state in search of better opportunities. By the time she was 23, she had already learned that trust came at a price, and sometimes the safest place to be was nowhere at all. She drifted from apartment to apartment, city to city, never staying long enough for roots to grow, moving between Cleveland, Detroit, Michigan, and eventually Erie, Pennsylvania. Each city held promises of stability, jobs, friends, and love. But for every small victory, there seemed to be an equal heartbreak lurking just around the corner. On a chilly evening in Cleveland, she sat on the small balcony of her rented apartment, watching the streetlights glint off the wet pavement. She clutched a cup of lukewarm coffee, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing against her chest. The diner job she had just started barely covered rent, and her car, an aging hatchback, coughed more than it ran. She thought about the people she had met that day. A man with kind eyes who smiled too easily, a neighbor who waved politely, a coworker who seemed too interested in her personal life. Somewhere between trying to survive and craving connection, she realized she had begun trusting again, and that thought made her uneasy. Life in Detroit had been a mix of fleeting friendships and unnoticed kindnesses. She remembered late nights walking along the sidewalks of downtown Detroit, the cold biting through her coat, wondering if she was just a shadow moving between the lives of others. One evening, she had met a woman at a small convenience store who insisted on buying her coffee, simply because someone needs a break once in a while. That small act of generosity felt like a lighthouse in the fog, yet it also reminded her how fragile her existence had become. She needed people, yes, but she needed to be cautious. Because one wrong step, one misplaced trust could cost her everything. The first warning signs appeared subtly. In Erie, Pennsylvania, she noticed a car parked outside her apartment building more than once. A man had waved at her from the distance. She didn't recognize him, yet his presence felt deliberate. When she called the local coffee shop in Toledo, Ohio, to check on a friend, the conversation felt off, strained, almost rehearsed. The small details began to pile up. Unfamiliar footsteps echoing in empty hallways, a package left outside her door that she hadn't ordered, the occasional glance from strangers in stores that lingered too long. Something wasn't right, and deep down she knew she couldn't ignore it. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine living in a world where each city feels safe only because it's temporary, where each new face could be a friend or a threat. That was Rebecca's life. She had learned to navigate the delicate balance between hope and caution. Her heart wanted to trust, to believe in kindness, but her instincts screamed danger. And yet, she pressed on, believing that tomorrow could bring stability, a connection, a break from the shadows that seemed to follow her. In Cleveland, one evening, she confided in a roommate she had recently met. "I feel like someone's watching me," she whispered, pacing the small living room. The roommate, a young man named Derek, laughed it off at first, saying she was overthinking. But he noticed the tension in her voice, the way her hands trembled, and the way her eyes darted to the windows. A small part of him didn't believe her, yet a larger part of him wanted to protect her. That night, Rebecca went to bed uneasy, the feeling of being observed curling around her like a shadow. And she didn't know that this was only the beginning. The next morning, she left for work in Detroit. On the highway, she glanced in the rearview mirror more times than usual, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. When she reached the diner, her co-worker, a cheerful man named Troy, commented on her distracted behavior. "You okay?" he asked, and for a moment, she considered telling him everything. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she smiled faintly and said, "Just tired." Inside, fear and caution tangled with the hope of safety. She thought about the kindness she had experienced, the people she could trust, and the city streets that had started to feel like a maze she couldn't escape. Later that week, Rebecca received a text from someone she had considered a friend, someone she thought had her best interests at heart. It was brief, cryptic, and unsettling. "Be careful who you trust." She stared at the message for minutes, her pulse quickening. She wanted to respond, to ask for clarity, but instead, she shoved her phone in her bag, trying to shake the unease. Detroit felt colder than usual, and the streets seemed narrower, the shadows longer. Every instinct screamed danger, but she pressed forward, unwilling to surrender to fear. By evening, as snow began to fall lightly across Erie, she walked to a local convenience store for snacks, unaware that her every movement was being observed. Across the street, a figure lingered just beyond the glow of the streetlight, their gaze fixed on her, calculating. And though Rebecca didn't know it, her life was about to collide with something darker than she could have ever imagined. A betrayal waited, not in the shadows of strangers, but in the proximity of someone she had trusted. Someone who Rebecca believed was a friend had already marked her path, setting into motion the events that would lead to the horrific crime. Every small choice, every fleeting trust, was now a thread in a web she could not see, but the investigators would soon begin to unravel it. And as viewers, you're left wondering, who is she really trusting, and how far would someone go to erase her existence? The morning fog hung low over the streets of Toledo, Ohio, when Detective Marcus Hayes stepped out of his car, boots crunching against frost-hardened grass. The cold still hadn't left the air from the previous day, and the highway where Rebecca Koster's body had been found seemed almost empty, almost too quiet. He studied the spot again, the ground frozen but stained with traces that the killers had overlooked. Every detail had been painstakingly altered, every trace erased. Yet that single remnant remained, subtle but undeniable. Hayes knew that it was this tiny clue that could unravel the web surrounding her disappearance, and eventually her death. Somewhere in Cleveland, Detroit, or Erie, the pieces were beginning to line up. Meanwhile, in Cleveland, life carried on in quiet normalcy for those who didn't know her. But Rebecca's past was catching up to her, inching closer with every passing hour. Her former roommate, Derek, had been questioned by local authorities. They asked about her habits, her friends, the people she spent her evenings with. Each answer Derek gave seemed harmless on its own, yet when combined with other testimonies across Michigan and Pennsylvania, a pattern began to emerge. Rebecca had trusted the wrong people, people who had observed her vulnerabilities and weaknesses. She had thought fleeting friendships were genuine. In reality, some were calculated, cold, and patient. And that realization, though it hadn't reached her alive, would haunt her story. Back in Detroit, Troy, the diner co-worker, replayed Rebecca's last conversations in his head. Something about her had changed in the last week. Her laughter was forced, her smiles fleeting. Troy hadn't known why at the time, but now, looking at the news footage of Toledo's highway, the pieces fit together in a way that made his stomach twist. He wished he had said more, asked more, tried harder. But what could he have done? Life moves forward, people get busy, and danger hides behind ordinary days. For Rebecca, ordinary days had ended with a cruelty she could never have anticipated. Across Erie, Pennsylvania, neighbors recalled little details that seemed insignificant at first. A light left on in the apartment past midnight. Footsteps echoing in the hallways. A small package at the door she never opened. None of these things meant anything to anyone individually. But collectively, they told a story of a life under observation, a person who had unknowingly invited danger closer. The investigators in Lucas County had already begun tracing these threads. They spoke with witnesses from 3 states, analyzing movements, phone calls, and interactions. Every step Rebecca had taken across Cleveland, Detroit, and Erie mattered because it all led back to one fact: someone close had betrayed her. The betrayal was subtle, like the turning of a knife that nobody noticed until the pain was too deep to ignore. Someone she had trusted, someone who had shared meals, laughs, and stories with her, had planted themselves in her life for a purpose that was impossible to imagine. And while the investigators pieced together the forensic trail, Rebecca's life flashed in fragmented memories. Walking home from work on rain-slicked streets in Detroit, stopping for a cup of coffee from a stranger's kindness, pausing under the glow of streetlights in Erie, wondering if she could ever feel safe again. She had believed briefly that people could be good, but some of that goodness had been a mask hiding intentions that were darker than anyone could see. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine walking alone in a city at night, feeling safe enough to let your guard down, only to realize later that the person beside you was the reason danger had found you. That was the cruel reality Rebecca faced. And while the investigators traced every detail, every location, every interaction across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, she remained powerless to intervene. The audience can feel her fear, her uncertainty, her fleeting hope, and that's what makes her story hit so close to home. Detectives received a tip that sent chills through the squad. A local shopkeeper in Cleveland recalled seeing Rebecca with someone unfamiliar, someone she appeared to know, but whose presence had unsettled her. Hayes and his team raced to cross-reference security footage from the area, while forensic teams combed through evidence collected in Detroit. The trail was narrow but growing sharper. Every location she had visited, every interaction she had made, now contributed to a timeline. The person behind this had underestimated the investigators, and that single mistake, the overlooked detail, was about to expose more than anyone expected. The tension escalated further when Lucas County detectives noticed a familiar pattern emerging in Erie. Surveillance cameras, interviews, and phone records revealed a person following her movements subtly but consistently. Not a stranger. Someone who knew her schedule, her habits, her vulnerabilities. And while authorities pieced together the physical evidence, the psychological picture became clearer. Rebecca's life, once seemingly ordinary, had been manipulated with precision. The betrayal was not random. It was personal. And for the first time, investigators realized they weren't just searching for a suspect. They were uncovering the deliberate orchestration of a life ending too soon. By the evening, Rebecca's past and the investigation intersected in a single, terrifying revelation. The friend she had confided in, someone she had allowed close, might not have been innocent. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a possibility that changed the entire scope of the case. And while the investigators in Ohio and Michigan began to trace this lead, viewers are left to wonder. How often do we unknowingly invite danger by trusting the wrong people? How close do these betrayals lurk, and what would you do if faced with them? As detectives prepared to confront the person in Cleveland who had been shadowing Rebecca, a new lead arrived from Detroit. An anonymous tip revealing a connection that nobody could have predicted. The streets of Erie, Pennsylvania, glistened under a light layer of frost, the kind of frost that catches the streetlights and turns every surface into a fragile, sparkling illusion. Rebecca Koster walked quickly, hugging her coat tighter against the chill, her breath rising in soft clouds. Her boots crunched against the frozen sidewalk, echoing in the empty streets. Normally, she loved the crispness of winter mornings, the way they made her feel alive, awake, aware. But that morning, the city felt different. There was an unease she couldn't shake, a shadow in the corners of her vision that had nothing to do with the cold. Something was wrong, and deep down, she knew it. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a text from someone she had trusted for months. It was short, cryptic, and unsettling. "Don't go anywhere alone. Not today." Rebecca stared at the screen, the words feeling heavier than any winter coat. She thought about her day ahead, walking to the diner where she worked, buying groceries, checking her mailbox. Each ordinary task now carried a weight she had never felt before. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, insidious, creeping into your thoughts until even the simplest decisions feel like life-or-death calculations. As she walked toward the diner on State Street, her eyes flicked to every shadow, every passing car. A man leaning against a lamppost looked familiar, though she couldn't place him. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the frost biting her fingers. Her heart pounded as she imagined scenarios, some rational, some terrifyingly not. By the time she arrived at the diner, she was breathless not just from the walk, but from the fear pressing against her chest. Inside, the warmth of the diner offered a brief reprieve. The hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the smell of coffee. It should have been comforting. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that someone outside was watching, waiting. Troy, her co-worker, noticed immediately. "You okay?" he asked, concern tugging at his voice. She nodded, forcing a smile. "Just the cold," she said, though she didn't believe it herself. Troy's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, sensing something more. A few minutes later, he went back to serving tables, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts, her instincts screaming at her that she was being observed. Back in Cleveland, Detective Marcus Hayes was piecing together a timeline. The small clues from Erie, Rebecca's phone records, eyewitness accounts, the cryptic text, were beginning to form a picture, a pattern that suggested she had been followed for days, maybe weeks. Hayes and his team compared camera footage from the streets of Cleveland, Detroit, and Erie. Every detail mattered. The make of a car, the direction someone had walked, the timing of a text. And then it hit him, a subtle, almost invisible anomaly in the footage. Someone had altered their movements to avoid detection, yet one small detail remained. A pattern that could break the case wide open. Meanwhile, Rebecca returned to her small apartment in Erie after her shift. She locked the door carefully, double-checked the windows, and tried to calm her racing mind. Her apartment was modest, barely furnished, but it was her sanctuary. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out over the quiet streets. That's when she noticed the shadow again. This time it moved. Someone walking slowly along the sidewalk outside, lingering near the corner. Her heart leapt. She wanted to run, but her body felt frozen. She grabbed her phone, debating whether to call someone, the police, or even a friend in Cleveland. The night seemed endless. Every sound, distant footsteps, a car door slamming, a dog barking, made her flinch. Her mind raced back to every moment that had felt slightly off, every person she had trusted too quickly. She thought about the kindnesses she had received in Detroit, the woman who had bought her coffee, the neighbor who had waved, and wondered how trust had become such a dangerous currency. It was in these quiet, terrifying moments that she realized the betrayal wasn't abstract. It wasn't a stranger lurking in the distance. It was someone who knew her patterns, her habits, her weaknesses. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine living in a world where your instincts tell you something is wrong, yet everyone around you dismisses it. That was Rebecca's reality. And it wasn't just fear, it was the kind of fear that sharpens your senses, forces you to notice every detail, and yet leaves you feeling utterly powerless. The streets of Erie became a labyrinth, each corner an alleyway a potential trap, each shadow a potential threat. The following day, Hayes' team traced her last known route from Erie to Detroit, mapping out stops at convenience stores, diners, and bus stations. They noted interactions with strangers, recorded movements, and flagged every instance that deviated from normal patterns. They found inconsistencies in her timeline, small gaps where she could have been intercepted. Meanwhile, Rebecca, unaware of the investigation, continued her routine cautiously, checking over her shoulder at every turn. Her instincts told her she wasn't alone, and the pattern she sensed was real, chillingly so. As the week progressed, Rebecca began receiving phone calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Silent calls. Each one made her flinch, her pulse quicken. She tried blocking them, but new numbers appeared. The tension in her life escalated, and the city that had once felt like a place of fleeting opportunity now seemed claustrophobic, dangerous, and unrelenting. In her moments of solitude, she remembered conversations from friends in Cleveland, the way they had laughed at her careful paranoia. She wished they understood, wished they could see what she saw. But now it was too late. Someone had already marked her, shadowed her, and chosen the moment to strike. The investigators picked up another clue in Toledo. A sanitation worker remembered seeing a car parked near the highway the day before Rebecca's disappearance. The license plate was partially obscured, but it suggested a connection with a person Rebecca had trusted, someone from her past in Detroit. Hayes immediately coordinated with Michigan authorities. Every state line she had crossed, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, now became a piece of a larger puzzle. And the overlooked detail, the one element that remained despite the killer's planning, was starting to reveal the story of who she had trusted and who had betrayed her. That evening, Rebecca decided to visit a friend in Cleveland, hoping that being around someone familiar would ease the growing tension in her chest. She took the bus, clutching her bag tightly, scanning every passing face. Something felt off, though she couldn't name it. The bus passed through Detroit streets, then crossed into Ohio, the snow beginning to fall lightly, dusting the city in deceptive serenity. Her mind wandered to the text she had received days before. "Don't go anywhere alone. Not today." At the time, she had brushed it off. Now, every word carried weight. Every suggestion became a warning she wished she had heeded. By the time she arrived in Cleveland, night had fallen. The city lights shimmered off wet streets, painting reflections that made it hard to distinguish the real from the illusion. Rebecca walked quickly, ignoring the chill, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. She reached her friend's apartment and knocked, relief flooding her as the door opened. But before she could step inside, a shadow detached itself from the alleyway across the street. She froze. And in that instant, a figure she thought she could trust emerged from behind the shadow. Someone who had been in her life for months, someone who knew her routines, someone whose intentions were anything but innocent. Before Rebecca could react, a sudden noise, shattering glass from a nearby storefront, startled her, drawing her attention just long enough for the figure to vanish into the night. And as the city slept under a blanket of snow, the danger she had sensed for weeks was about to catch up with her, leaving investigators in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania racing against time to uncover the truth. The icy wind swept through the streets of Toledo, Ohio, cutting through even the thickest coats, and it carried with it the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones. Detective Marcus Hayes pulled his jacket tighter around him as he surveyed the highway where Rebecca Koster's body had been discovered weeks earlier. The scene was still fresh in his mind. The frozen earth, the meticulous way every identifying feature had been removed, and that one small detail, subtle yet undeniable, that no one could explain. That detail was starting to take shape in the investigators' minds, connecting dots across Cleveland, Detroit, and Erie. It was a fragile thread, but it was growing stronger with every piece of evidence they uncovered. Meanwhile, in Erie, Pennsylvania, Rebecca's life had been shifting quietly, though danger lurked behind each ordinary moment. She had begun noticing patterns, strangers lingering too long in store aisles, cars parked near her apartment on multiple days, and the occasional call from numbers she didn't recognize. Fear had become a constant companion, and though she tried to push it aside, her instincts never stopped whispering that something was wrong. She felt the tension in her chest tighten every time she left her apartment, and every shadow seemed to carry the weight of unseen eyes following her. Rebecca had trusted people in her life. Friends in Cleveland, co-workers in Detroit, neighbors in Erie, but trust had a price. She was beginning to learn that the kindness of strangers could be a mask for something more dangerous. One afternoon, as she walked down a quiet street in Erie, she saw someone who looked familiar. A figure standing under a streetlight, half in shadow, half illuminated by the glow of the winter sun. Her pulse quickened. She thought she had recognized a former co-worker, someone she had laughed with at the diner in Detroit. But the way the figure lingered, watching, was anything but friendly. Fear began to spiral, sharpening her instincts to a razor's edge. Across Ohio, Hayes and his team were coordinating with law enforcement in Michigan and Pennsylvania. Every scrap of evidence was being logged, every phone call traced, every surveillance tape combed over with painstaking attention. They noticed a pattern in Rebecca's movements, a series of subtle shifts in her routines that suggested she had sensed something, though she couldn't explain it. The investigators began connecting the dots, understanding that the danger she had felt was not imagined. It was real, and the person responsible was patient, deliberate, and familiar with her habits. Back in Erie, Rebecca was careful to avoid walking alone after dark. She took detours, changed her routes, and paid close attention to the people around her. She remembered the cryptic text she had received weeks earlier. "Don't go anywhere alone. Not today." At the time, she had dismissed it, thinking it was a prank or a misunderstanding. But now, as she hurried down the sidewalk with her coat collar pulled high, she realized it had been a warning she should have taken seriously. Every instinct screamed that someone was watching, and every small action she had taken was being noted, cataloged, and analyzed by someone who had her life in their hands. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine living in constant fear, knowing that the people you trust might be the ones putting you in danger. Rebecca had begun to understand that the world was not always kind, and that even fleeting moments of security could be dangerous illusions. Her mind raced with possibilities, with what-ifs, and the emotional weight of vulnerability pressed down on her like the winter snow. In Cleveland, investigators were beginning to identify individuals who had been in Rebecca's orbit during her time in Detroit and Erie. Each person was scrutinized for behavior that might indicate knowledge of her routines or malicious intent. One name kept appearing, a friend she had confided in, someone who had always seemed trustworthy, someone who had offered guidance, support, and companionship. That trust, which had once felt like a shield, was now a glaring vulnerability. Hayes understood that this person could hold the key to everything, from the patterns of her movements to the ultimate betrayal that led to her disappearance. Meanwhile, Rebecca's intuition guided her to a small cafe in Erie, a place she had discovered while walking home from work. She had come there before for comfort, a small ritual to ground herself amidst the uncertainty of her transient life. But as she entered, the feeling of being watched returned with renewed intensity. Every face seemed to hold a hidden intention, and the walls of the cafe, normally cozy and familiar, now felt like the confines of a trap. She ordered her coffee, trying to steady her nerves, but every sound, the clatter of cups, the conversations at nearby tables, even the hum of the espresso machine, was amplified in her mind like warning signals she couldn't ignore. As she sat in a corner, scanning the room, she noticed a man enter and linger near the door. He was too familiar in his movements, too aware of where she sat. Her pulse quickened. This was not a stranger, she could feel it. And just as she considered leaving, her phone buzzed. Another text, from a number she recognized now with dread. It read simply, "We know where you are." The words seemed to echo in her mind, an invisible hand closing around her. The fear that had been simmering in her chest boiled over into something more urgent, something impossible to ignore. Detectives in Lucas County, meanwhile, were analyzing the timeline from this moment. Every stop Rebecca had made, each cafe, diner, or store along her path from Cleveland to Detroit to Erie, was now a crucial piece of the investigation. They traced surveillance footage, reviewed phone records, and compared witness accounts. Each layer revealed that Rebecca had been observed long before the body was found. The meticulous planning of the perpetrator was becoming painfully clear. They had studied her routines, her habits, even her instincts. And yet, in their calculations, they had overlooked one critical detail: the small, human element that would eventually unravel everything. By late evening, Rebecca had decided to head back to her apartment. Snow began to fall heavily, blanketing the streets in white. Her footprints were quickly erased by the accumulation, but she didn't notice. All she could feel was the relentless tension pressing at her back, the knowledge that someone was always just out of sight, following her, waiting. As she neared her building, she felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a stillness that wasn't there before. She stopped, listening, straining to hear any sound. Then, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the street. It was a figure she knew, someone who had been part of her life for months, someone whose trust she had not questioned, until now. And in the distance, the faint glow of a streetlight revealed a subtle movement, a gesture, a signal that she couldn't yet interpret. Her mind raced, trying to assess the situation, trying to calculate the threat. But before she could react, a sudden noise, metal scraping against concrete, startled her, causing her to stumble. The figure disappeared into the night, leaving her frozen with fear and uncertainty. The snow had stopped falling in Erie, Pennsylvania, but the streets were still slick with ice, reflecting the glow of streetlights like broken mirrors. Rebecca Koster hurried along the sidewalk, her boots slipping occasionally, her coat wrapped tight around her, her breath forming little clouds in the freezing air. She felt exposed, more than she ever had. Every step felt heavy, as if the city itself was pressing down on her. She could sense someone watching, just beyond the glow of the lights, and a part of her wished she had never moved from Cleveland, never chased a fresh start in Detroit, never sought refuge in Erie. But those choices, ordinary at the time, had brought her here, to the moment where fear had become a constant companion. Inside a small diner on the edge of Erie, she paused for a moment, seeking warmth, a sense of safety, even if it was temporary. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon was comforting, yet her mind couldn't stop racing. She replayed the cryptic text she had received days before. "We know where you are." That message had terrified her, and now, with the snow-covered streets outside and shadows lurking everywhere, it felt like a countdown. Every interaction, every footstep, every glance over her shoulder was a test she didn't want to take. Yet she had no choice but to move through it, because life continued regardless of fear. Meanwhile, in Cleveland, Detective Marcus Hayes and his team were piecing together a network of connections that stretched across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The investigation had grown more complex with each passing day. They had mapped Rebecca's movements, traced phone calls, checked surveillance footage, and cross-referenced witness reports. Every small inconsistency, an unrecognized car, a fleeting shadow, a missing timestamp, was now a potential lead. And in the middle of all these details, Hayes had noticed something chilling. The pattern suggested that someone had followed Rebecca deliberately, calculating each step, each pause, each decision. This was not random. This was planning. Rebecca left the diner and walked slowly toward her apartment. She paused at a crosswalk, looking both ways, feeling the chill of the night in her lungs. The streets were almost empty, the usual noise of city life replaced by the whisper of wind and the crunch of her boots on the ice. Her instincts screamed that she wasn't alone, that someone was shadowing her movements, just as the cryptic texts had suggested. She wanted to call someone, anyone, but she knew that making noise could also attract attention. Every decision carried risk now, and even simple survival required strategy. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine being constantly alert, walking down familiar streets, yet feeling like a stranger in your own life. That was Rebecca's reality. The fear she carried wasn't just about immediate danger. It was about betrayal, trust misplaced, and the slow realization that someone she had welcomed into her life might have been plotting against her all along. As she approached her apartment, she noticed a car parked across the street that seemed out of place. It was an older model, dark-colored, with its engine running. She couldn't see anyone inside clearly, but the presence of the vehicle immediately set her on edge. Her mind raced. Was it a random passerby, a neighbor, or the person who had been following her? She debated whether to duck into a nearby convenience store or confront the situation directly. Every moment counted, because danger didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, calculated, and often too late to escape. Across state lines in Detroit, Michigan, Hayes's team was reviewing phone data and surveillance footage simultaneously. Every connection Rebecca had made, friends, neighbors, coworkers, casual acquaintances, was scrutinized for unusual behavior. Patterns emerged. A few individuals seemed to appear in multiple locations she had recently visited. Every state she had passed through became a puzzle piece, and the one missing piece was someone she had trusted implicitly. That trust, so ordinary and human, had become the focal point of the investigation. Rebecca, meanwhile, finally reached the door of her apartment building. She fumbled with her keys, glancing over her shoulder repeatedly. The car across the street remained, its presence unnerving, yet it didn't move. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, feeling the relief of temporary safety. But even within the walls of her apartment, she couldn't relax. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound of the wind against the window, reminded her that her life was now under surveillance in ways she hadn't imagined. The sense of being hunted, the betrayal lurking in her past connections, and the meticulous planning of an unseen adversary had turned her existence into a precarious balance of fear and survival. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind replayed the events of the past week. Every interaction, every text, every suspicious figure was scrutinized and analyzed. She thought about Derek, the roommate from Cleveland, and Troy, the diner coworker in Detroit. She thought about the stranger who had left the package outside her Erie apartment weeks earlier, the cryptic warnings, and the shadowy figures who seemed to follow her across state lines. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that were more memories than imagination. Moments of kindness that had masked danger, moments of laughter that had hidden betrayal, moments of safety that had been illusions. The following morning, Rebecca received another text. It was simple, stark, and even more threatening than before. Tonight. She stared at it, frozen. The single word carried weight, implication, and fear. Her instinct was to flee, but where could she go? Cleveland? Detroit? Erie? Each city had been touched by the same network, each location vulnerable, and each step tracked. She realized that she was trapped, not by walls or locks, but by betrayal, surveillance, and the meticulous planning of someone she had trusted. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Now imagine knowing that someone close to you, someone you've trusted, might be orchestrating danger behind the scenes. That realization, that gut-wrenching knowledge, changes every choice, every interaction, and every step you take. For Rebecca, it was a slow, crushing truth that pressed on her heart every day, transforming ordinary streets into a web of uncertainty. By afternoon, Hayes had a breakthrough. Analysis of Rebecca's phone data showed consistent patterns. She had been in contact with someone she thought she could trust, someone whose movements aligned suspiciously with her own. Every text, every phone call, every meeting she had attended was being cross-referenced with surveillance footage across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Hayes realized the enormity of the betrayal. It wasn't just a fleeting lapse of judgment. It was intentional, calculated, and relentless. The person she trusted had been manipulating her, observing her, and ensuring that every step she took was predictable. Rebecca, unaware of the investigation's progress, went about her day cautiously. She avoided the streets she usually walked, changed routes repeatedly, and stayed in public areas as much as possible. But fear has a way of wearing you down. Every interaction felt charged with tension, every passing glance a potential threat, and every ordinary task became a test of nerve. She realized that survival now depended on vigilance, strategy, and intuition. And her intuition had been screaming at her for weeks. Someone she trusted was not who they seemed. That evening, as snow began to fall lightly again over Erie, Rebecca made the decision to reach out to a friend in Cleveland. She needed reassurance, safety, and human contact. The bus ride north was tense. Every stop, every passenger, every glance out the window was a potential risk. And as she neared Cleveland, her sense of foreboding intensified. She had no idea that the figure she feared most was already in the city, waiting for her arrival, orchestrating the next steps of a plan that had been in motion for weeks. As the bus rolled into Cleveland, a familiar figure slipped quietly along the platform, blending into the crowd. They knew exactly where Rebecca would be, exactly what she would do, and exactly how to keep her unaware until it was too late. Across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, investigators were racing against time to catch up. But the betrayal was already unfolding, and the first major confrontation was imminent. The streets of Cleveland, Ohio, were slick with remnants of melted snow, reflecting the orange glow of streetlights in distorted, fractured patterns. Rebecca Koster stepped off the bus, her bag clutched tightly, her coat collar pulled high. Her mind was a storm of worry and caution. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Every step she took felt deliberate, calculated, yet still too visible, too traceable. The city, familiar yet distant, seemed alive with shadows, and the air carried a tension that prickled at her skin. She had the sense, deep in her bones, that someone was already waiting, observing, and she wasn't sure whether she would notice them in time. Across town, Detective Marcus Hayes pored over surveillance footage from the bus station and nearby streets. Hours of recordings, dozens of potential leads, all of them converging on a pattern that had gone unnoticed until now. Someone was moving parallel to Rebecca, always just a block away, a car in the right place at the right time, a figure fading in and out of frame like a ghost. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate, and it was terrifying. Hayes and his team realized that they were watching the movements of someone orchestrating a hunt, someone exploiting trust and routine in a way that was calculated, patient, and chilling. Rebecca walked quickly down the street, her boots clicking against the pavement. She had chosen this route deliberately, thinking it safer. But safety was relative, and she felt it slipping away with every passing minute. Her mind raced through all the possible outcomes. Was it the former roommate from Cleveland, Derek, who had seemed nervous the last time they spoke? Was it Troy, the co-worker from Detroit who had lingered too long with questions about her schedule? Or was it someone she hadn't even suspected, someone closer, someone who had been a part of her life for months without her realizing their true intentions? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine walking through familiar streets, knowing that every corner could hide danger, every shadow could hold betrayal, and every face could carry hidden motives. That was Rebecca's reality. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival, finely tuned instincts that screamed at her even when the world seemed calm. Rebecca reached the small cafe she had used as a temporary safe spot in Cleveland. She stepped inside, inhaling the warm air, hoping for a brief reprieve from the cold and tension. But even inside, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her eyes scanned the room reflexively, searching for any sign of the figure she feared. She noticed a man sitting in the corner, his posture casual but attentive, scanning the entrance whenever the door opened. Something about him set off alarms in her mind. She ordered her coffee and tried to appear calm, but the sense of danger didn't dissipate. Meanwhile, Hayes and his team had identified a potential lead. Phone records from Erie, Detroit, and Cleveland pointed to a pattern of repeated contact with a number that belonged to someone Rebecca had trusted deeply. Each text, each call, each brief meeting seemed to coincide with her movements, as though her life had been mapped out in advance. Hayes reviewed the data repeatedly, double-checking for errors, but everything pointed to a betrayal far more personal than anyone had anticipated. The person she had confided in, shared her fears with, laughed with. This same person could now be at the center of the case, orchestrating a chain of events that had brought her to this moment. Rebecca's coffee grew cold as she weighed her options. The streets outside were no longer a simple path from point A to point B. They were a potential trap. The bus lines she had used for weeks might have been observed, her routes memorized. Every detail of her daily life, her habits, her moments of vulnerability, had been exploited. And yet she needed answers. She had to confront the truth, even if it meant facing someone who had once been her friend, someone she had trusted implicitly. The night descended on Cleveland, thick and heavy, wrapping the city in a quiet tension. Rebecca left the cafe cautiously, avoiding well-lit streets and open areas. Her instincts screamed that she was being followed, that someone was ready to strike. She moved faster, yet carefully, making her steps deliberate, but not conspicuous. Every glance over her shoulder made her heart pound faster, but she couldn't let fear dictate her actions entirely. She had to survive. Across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the investigation had reached a critical point. Surveillance cameras had been cross-referenced, phone records analyzed, and witnesses interviewed. Each location Rebecca had visited provided a puzzle piece, each piece revealing more about the network of people who had intersected with her life. Hayes's team had begun to identify discrepancies in alibis, small inconsistencies in stories, and subtle signs of deceit. The picture was forming, but time was a luxury Rebecca no longer had. Rebecca paused outside a small apartment building in Cleveland, the address a contact she trusted had given her. She hesitated, her hand on the doorknob, as a sense of dread coiled in her stomach. Something about the building felt off. The shadows in the alleyways stretched longer than they should, the sounds of the city quieter, as if holding its breath. And then movement. Across the street, the figure she had sensed all along stepped into the light. A person who had been part of her life, whose presence had once felt comforting, now radiating an ominous weight. Her pulse raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She entered the building, taking the stairs two at a time, her senses heightened to every creak of the floorboards. She reached the apartment door, and as she turned the knob, her phone buzzed again. Another text. "I'm closer than you think." Panic surged, but she masked it, using her wits to maintain composure. She stepped inside, locking the door behind her, and leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. Meanwhile, Hayes's team had traced an IP location corresponding to the text. The source was nearby, close enough that they believed it could lead directly to the suspect. Calls were made to local law enforcement in Cleveland, and a tactical plan was put in motion. Every detail mattered. The realization hit Hayes that the betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was logistical, meticulously orchestrated, and calculated to manipulate Rebecca into a vulnerable position. As the night deepened, Rebecca heard a faint sound outside her apartment, footsteps, slow and deliberate, pausing at intervals. Her mind raced, cataloging every possible scenario. Could it be someone checking if she had left? Someone making sure she remained inside? Or was it the person who had betrayed her, ensuring the trap was set? Her instincts told her to move, to escape, but every option carried risk. She needed clarity, a plan, and perhaps a confrontation she wasn't sure she was ready for. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine discovering that someone you trusted implicitly might have been orchestrating events behind the scenes, manipulating your life, watching every step you took, and planning a betrayal that could shatter everything. How would you react? What would you do? Comment below with your thoughts. Suddenly the doorknob rattled, not violently but deliberately. Rebecca froze. She knew this sound. It wasn't forced entry. It was someone testing her, someone daring her to respond. Her heart pounded in her ears. She considered calling Hayes or the Cleveland police, but she also realized that she might be seconds away from confronting the person responsible for weeks of fear, deception, and surveillance. The tension was unbearable. Outside the apartment door, a familiar voice whispered a name Rebecca hadn't expected to hear. Her name, soft, intimate, and chilling. It was the person she had trusted the most, the person Hayes had identified as a key figure in the investigation. And as she clutched the door handle, the realization hit her like ice water. The betrayal she had feared all along was about to unfold in real time, and nothing in Ohio, Michigan, or Pennsylvania would be the same after tonight. The streets of Cleveland were quiet, almost eerily so, as Rebecca Koster pressed herself against the wall of her apartment hallway. Her breath was shallow, and her pulse thundered in her ears. She could hear it, the faint shuffle of shoes on the sidewalk outside, the soft hum of a car idling down the street. The city, with all its normal noises and bustle, had turned into a predator's playground, each sound amplified, each shadow a potential threat. She gripped her phone tightly, debating whether to call Hayes or the local police, but she feared that doing so could trigger the very danger she had been anticipating. Meanwhile, Detective Marcus Hayes was on high alert. Every lead had brought him closer to the truth, and now, after tracing Rebecca's phone data and surveillance footage across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, a pattern was emerging. Someone she had trusted completely had not only been tracking her, but had also manipulated her movements, steering her into increasingly vulnerable situations. The realization left Hayes both frustrated and determined. Time was running out, and the final pieces of this puzzle were about to collide in a confrontation that would shock even the most seasoned investigators. Rebecca's mind raced through all possibilities. Who outside could be orchestrating this? Her former roommate from Cleveland, a co-worker from Detroit, or perhaps the neighbor in Erie, who had always been a little too friendly. Her thoughts turned inward. Had she misjudged someone she thought she could trust? The cryptic messages, "Don't go anywhere alone," "Not today," and "We know where you are," now carried a weight far heavier than simple threats. They were proof that someone close had intimate knowledge of her routines, her fears, and her vulnerabilities. Every instinct told her that the next move could be life-altering. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Have you ever had a moment where your gut instinct screamed danger, but you weren't sure if it was paranoia or reality? That's exactly where Rebecca was. On the edge of fear and intuition, her every decision a test of survival, her mind hyper-focused on the smallest detail that could save her. As night deepened, she decided to leave her apartment and confront the unknown, taking small, careful steps along the familiar streets of Cleveland. Each light post, each shadow, each passing car made her flinch. She moved slowly, deliberately, counting each step in her head, aware that the city itself had become a labyrinth of threats. She reached the small coffee shop she had used as a temporary refuge before, hoping for a sense of normalcy. But the warmth inside offered little comfort. The man who had once seemed a harmless observer was there again, blending into the background, watching, waiting. Across state lines, Hayes' team coordinated with Cleveland police and Michigan authorities. Every small piece of evidence, Rebecca's interactions, sightings, texts, and calls, was mapped meticulously. The investigation had revealed a pattern. Someone close to Rebecca, someone she had confided in repeatedly, had been orchestrating her movements, manipulating circumstances, and exploiting every trust she had placed. It was no longer just a case of following her. This was a premeditated plan calculated down to the smallest detail, spanning Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Rebecca sat at a corner table, her coffee untouched, her hands wrapped around the cup for warmth. She watched the entrance constantly, her senses on high alert. Every figure that walked through the door was scrutinized, every glance dissected. The tension in the room was almost tangible, pressing down like the snow-covered streets outside. She could feel the weight of being hunted, and for the first time, the thought of escape seemed complicated. The streets of Cleveland, Detroit, Erie, and Toledo had all been mapped, observed, and analyzed by someone who knew her patterns intimately. And now that person was here, close enough to reach her if she made a single wrong move. A sudden noise outside made her flinch. The man in the corner raised his eyes, pretending to be absorbed in his own drink, but Rebecca noticed the subtle movements, the way he checked the door, the slight tension in his shoulders. Instinctively, she knew that he was the same figure who had followed her across city lines, whose presence had been felt, if not seen, in Erie and Detroit. Her mind raced. How had she been so blind? How had someone so familiar become so threatening? Fear twisted inside her like a living thing, but a spark of determination also grew. She wasn't going to be a passive participant in this. Back in Detroit, Hayes coordinated a plan to intercept the suspect if Rebecca could provide a real-time location. Tracking her phone, cross-referencing city cameras, and coordinating with Cleveland authorities created a network that spanned 3 states. Every movement she made could be used to trap the person responsible. Hayes understood the gravity. Rebecca's life hung in the balance, And the betrayal she had endured was not just emotional. It was active, immediate, and dangerous. Rebecca finished her coffee and stood, decision made. She moved deliberately toward the exit, noting every detail of the cafe layout, the position of the man in the corner, and the street outside. Her instincts guided her, but so did fear, and she realized that the confrontation she had been avoiding was inevitable. Each step felt like a negotiation with fate itself. The city around her, the familiar streets, the faint hum of cars, the distant streetlights, had become both protector and threat. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine having to face someone who had betrayed your trust while knowing that every step, every decision, and every glance was being monitored. That was Rebecca's reality. What would you do in her position? How would you prepare yourself for a confrontation that could change everything? Comment below with your thoughts, because sometimes life forces us to face truths we never wanted to see. As she stepped outside, the winter air hit her sharply, the cold biting at her cheeks. Her eyes scanned every corner, every parked car, and every passerby. And then she saw it, a shadow moving quickly across the street, disappearing behind a row of buildings. Her heart leapt. She knew the figure. It was someone she had trusted implicitly, someone she had allowed into her life, someone who now held the power to destroy everything she valued. The betrayal that had haunted her instincts for weeks was about to unfold in the most intimate, terrifying way possible. Rebecca Koster's heart raced as she stood in the dimly lit alley just off the main street in Cleveland. Snow crunched beneath her boots, each step echoing against brick walls, each sound amplified by the quiet night. She knew the figure she had sensed for weeks was nearby, watching, waiting. Her phone buzzed again, and she flinched. Another text, "Don't move." Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, steadying her shaking hands. She couldn't run blindly. She had to be smart, or the person who had betrayed her would succeed. Meanwhile, Detective Marcus Hayes was reviewing the latest surveillance feeds from Cleveland, Detroit, and Erie, triangulating Rebecca's location. Every moment counted. Hayes understood that the person she had trusted, the one who had been part of her life, who had monitored her across multiple states, was close enough to strike. Phone signals, vehicle sightings, and camera feeds all pointed to a critical moment. Rebecca's instincts had been right all along, but the confrontation was inevitable. Rebecca hugged the side of the alley wall, peeking around the corner. The figure appeared. Familiar, calm, confident. Someone she had allowed into her life, someone whose presence had once felt safe. Now, every interaction she had shared with this person was laced with fear, betrayal, and questions she didn't want to ask. "Why?" she whispered under her breath. The answer was coming, whether she was ready or not. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine discovering that someone you trusted completely had been plotting against you, watching your every move, and now stands mere feet away. How would you react? Would you confront them, or try to escape? Comment your thoughts below. The figure stepped closer, calm and deliberate, their gaze locked on Rebecca. The betrayal that had haunted her instincts across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania now had a face. Her mind raced with memories, texts ignored, small inconsistencies, friendly advice that had seemed ordinary but was now sinister. She realized with a sinking feeling that the plan had been meticulously orchestrated, using her routines and trust against her. Rebecca's breath came in shallow bursts as she weighed her options. Escape was risky, confrontation even riskier. And yet, she couldn't let fear dictate the outcome. Her instincts sharpened, honed over weeks of stalking, texts, and cryptic warnings. She noticed a detail, the way the figure's phone glinted under the streetlight. That phone could hold evidence, proof of every surveillance move, every manipulated step she had taken. A plan formed in her mind. She would have to act, but she had to do it with precision. Meanwhile, Hayes coordinated with Cleveland authorities. Every potential exit from the alley was monitored. Backup units were in position, ready to intervene, and every piece of intelligence collected from Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania was converging on this critical moment. Rebecca's survival, the revelation of the betrayal, and the capture of the suspect depended on timing, strategy, and courage. Rebecca stepped forward slowly, voice firm despite her trembling hands. "Why?" she demanded, her words cutting through the icy night. The figure froze, caught off guard by the sudden confrontation. For a brief moment, the world seemed suspended, snow drifting silently, cars passing in the distance, footsteps fading. The betrayal, the weeks of fear, the manipulation, all came into sharp focus. The figure's response was a whisper, almost inaudible. "You should have trusted me." It was chilling, deliberate, and stripped away the illusion of safety Rebecca had clung to. Her pulse raced faster, but she didn't step back. Instead, she used the distraction to grab the phone, her hands shaking but determined. Hayes and his team, watching through a coordinated grid of cameras, were ready to intervene at the first sign of danger. Just as Rebecca wrestled the phone from the figure's grip, a shout echoed from the alley entrance. Cleveland police had arrived. The figure bolted, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Rebecca standing alone, clutching the evidence that could finally expose the betrayal spanning Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The confrontation had begun, but the resolution, and the truth behind every manipulated step, was still seconds away. The alley in Cleveland felt narrower than ever, shadows pressing in from every side. Snow swirled around Rebecca Koster's boots, melting in patches under the dim streetlights, and her breath came in short, jagged bursts. She had the phone clutched in one hand, the evidence, the proof, the key to everything, and her other hand pressed against the brick wall for balance. The figure she had trusted was still out there, just beyond the light, watching her every move. Fear and fury collided inside her chest, a storm that made every heartbeat echo like a drum in the quiet night. Detective Marcus Hayes was coordinating with Cleveland officers, tracking Rebecca's location in real time. From his command center in Toledo, Ohio, he could see every surveillance feed, every camera along the streets she had traveled, and every potential escape route the figure might attempt. Hayes's team had traced the suspect's patterns across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and now the convergence was here. The betrayal, the deception, the manipulation, all of it was coming to a head and seconds counted. Rebecca's mind flashed back to Erie, Pennsylvania, to Detroit, Michigan, to Toledo, Ohio. The cities she had fled, the streets she had crossed, the people she had trusted, the warnings she had ignored. Every moment of doubt, every instinct she had brushed aside, now screamed in her ears. The person who had betrayed her, someone she had confided in, someone who had been part of her life for months, was about to confront her. But she wasn't the same person she had been weeks ago. She had endured fear, tracked threats, survived manipulation. And now, for the first time, she felt the power of facing the truth. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. Imagine standing in the middle of a confrontation that could change everything in your life. Someone you trusted, someone who watched your every move, is right in front of you. What would you do? Would you freeze or fight back? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rebecca took a step forward, her voice steady despite the fear. It's over. I know everything. The figure paused, as if surprised that she had spoken first, as if the calmness in her voice was a weapon. The snow swirled around them, masking movements, amplifying the tension. Hayes's team was watching from multiple cities, prepared to intervene at the first sign of danger, but Rebecca didn't flinch. She held the phone like a shield and a sword, ready to expose the betrayal that had followed her across state lines. The figure's expression shifted, a flash of panic, then anger, then calculation. You think this changes anything? The voice hissed. Rebecca's stomach tightened. The manipulation, the tracking, the lies, it was all here, distilled into one moment. But she had prepared for this, and her courage had been forged in every cold alley, every crosswalk, every cafe, and every text warning. She held up the phone, evidence of the betrayal, of the tracking, of the manipulation that spanned Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Rebecca made a decision. She stepped closer, forcing the figure to retreat toward the street. Officers from Cleveland's police department appeared at the alley entrance, calling out commands. Hayes's team, watching from Toledo, coordinated with local units to block every escape route. The figure realized the trap had closed, panic flickering across their face, the carefully orchestrated plan unraveling in real time. Hi viewers, imagine standing in a moment where fear and courage collide. Have you ever faced someone who betrayed your trust and felt the weight of every decision in seconds? Comment your experience below. Let's hear your story. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to follow Rebecca Koster's journey. The figure lunged suddenly, desperate, but Rebecca was ready. She sidestepped, forcing them to stumble over a patch of ice, and the police moved in. Hands were raised, voices shouted, and the tension erupted into action. Hayes watched, heart pounding, as officers cuffed the suspect, removing the person who had haunted Rebecca's life across 3 states. Cleveland, Detroit, Erie, Toledo. Every city, every step, every manipulation came to a stop in that single chaotic moment. Rebecca sank against the wall, trembling, tears mixing with melting snow on her cheeks. The fear that had followed her, the betrayal she had endured, the weeks of survival, it all culminated here. Relief and exhaustion collided, leaving her speechless. She realized she had not only survived, but had confronted the source of her torment directly. She had turned fear into action, manipulation into exposure, and betrayal into accountability. As Hayes approached, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it. You stayed alive. You stayed smart. You did what most people wouldn't even dream of." Rebecca nodded, still catching her breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. The truth had been revealed, the betrayal confronted, the manipulator in custody. Justice, for once, felt tangible, reachable, real. Yet, even in relief, the shadows of doubt lingered. The manipulation had been so calculated, the betrayal so personal, that Rebecca knew some scars would remain. She thought of her journey across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The cities, the streets, the people she had met, the dangers she had faced, and she realized that survival had transformed her. The experience had been terrifying, heartbreaking, and empowering all at once. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. Hayes glanced at the screen and shook his head with a wry smile. Another message, not threatening this time, just a simple note from a friend she had confided in weeks earlier. "You're stronger than you know." Rebecca smiled through her tears. Strength, courage, survival. It had all been earned, and the journey across multiple states had shown her not only the dark side of trust, but also the power of resilience. Even with the suspect in custody, Hayes knew the investigation wasn't over. There were still questions to answer, threads to untangle across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and details of the betrayal that could take months to fully uncover. And somewhere in another city, another story was beginning, waiting for someone like Rebecca, someone who would face the impossible, confront fear, and expose the truth. If you were in Rebecca's shoes, how would you handle someone who betrayed your trust across multiple states? Comment below and inspire others with your thoughts. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new true crime stories, shocking revelations, or inspiring tales of courage and survival. Stay with us, because the next story could be just as life-changing, suspenseful, and eye-opening as Rebecca Koster's journey.